$250 a barrel. That number sounds like a typo. It is not. It is the price that would make 3 countries the richest they have ever been, push 2 major economies into recession within 90 days, and hand a single nation staggering paper wealth. Major oil shocks have historically summoned stagflation. Economists point to 1973, 1978, and 2008 as evidence. Those were shocks to the system that got oil to between $40 and $140 a barrel. We are talking about nearly tripling from today's price. When it does, certain parts of the world break entirely. Others erupt into a kind of wealth that defies description. The current price of Brent crude today is $78.95 per barrel. That is where we start. JPMorgan sees Brent averaging $60 in 2026, so the gap to $250 is historically unprecedented in peacetime. To get there, something would have to go very, very wrong, and the conditions are not as far-fetched as they sound. Crude prices surged from $2.59 per barrel in September 1973 to $11.65 by year-end, a 350% increase in weeks. The embargo cut 5 million barrels per day, 10% of global supply. That is all it took. US GDP contracted 3.2% in 1974, the worst year since the Great Depression. Unemployment rose from 4.8% to 9%. Inflation hit 11%, all from a 10% supply cut. Hold that frame in your mind as we walk through $250. All but one of the 11 post-war recessions were associated with an oil price increase. The relationship is not theoretical. The question is who bleeds first, who bleeds most, and who quietly profits while everyone else is in the emergency room. Let us start with the countries that get absolutely annihilated. First, Japan. Japan imports 77% of its oil from the Middle East, the most geopolitically volatile region on Earth. That is not a dependency. That is a vulnerability of breathtaking proportions. Japan imports roughly 3 million barrels per day. At $80, that is $88 billion per year. At $250, it is $274 billion. That is an additional $186 billion draining out of Japan's economy every year, nearly 4 times its defense budget. The Bank of Japan faces an impossible choice: raise rates and crush a debt-laden economy, or hold flat and watch the yen collapse. There is no good answer. Japan would be the first major economy to formally enter recession. Japan already has an aging population, stagnant productivity, and a debt-to-GDP ratio that makes others look responsible. Add an oil shock of this magnitude, and Japan enters a decade-long restructuring that reshapes geopolitics. Now Europe, 44 countries, a $17 trillion economy, and a relationship with imported energy you could call codependent. Imports account for over 2/3 of energy use in countries representing 20% of global GDP, including Germany, Japan, and Italy. The European Central Bank has warned of stagflation risk for energy-intensive economies. Germany is a particularly exquisite case study in economic vulnerability disguised as industrial strength. Germany built its industrial model around cheap Russian gas and cheap Middle Eastern oil. Then the Ukraine war happened. Germany discovered it had constructed an 11-lane highway with no off-ramp. At $250 a barrel, German industrial production does not slow, it stops. Chemical plants become unprofitable. Automakers face input cost explosions. A German recession at that severity ripples through the entire European Union because Germany is the fiscal anchor. You do not just get recession, you get political instability. And that historically metastasizes. Now let us pivot to India, the most tragic and fascinating story at $250. India is the 3rd largest oil importer in the world, more than 85% dependent on imports. India imports nearly 5 million barrels per day. At $78, the annual bill is $142 billion. At $250, it is $456 billion. India's entire GDP is roughly $3 trillion. The energy import bill would approach 15% of the entire economy. A $10 increase in oil prices raises India's import bill by $17, $18 billion. Scale that to a $170 increase, and you add nearly $300 billion. The rupee collapses. Higher oil prices increase demand for US dollars, putting pressure on the currency. The Reserve Bank of India faces the same impossible choice as Japan: pass costs to consumers or reduce fuel taxes. A sustained $10 increase can reduce India's GDP growth by 0.25 percentage points. Extrapolate that across $170, and growth drops to near zero. And here is the cruel part. India has 350 million people who cook using fuel. When oil goes to $250, cooking becomes a luxury. Japan currently imports roughly 3 million barrels per day. At $80 a barrel, that's a bill of about $88 billion per year just for crude oil. At $250 a barrel, that same volume of imports costs $274 billion annually. That's an additional $186 billion draining out of Japan's economy every single year. For context, Japan's entire defense budget is about $50 billion. We're talking about a cost increase of nearly 4 times Japan's defense budget hitting every single year from day one. Sustained energy price shocks could push inflation higher, tighten financial conditions, and complicate policy trade-offs. The costs of higher for longer oil prices would be felt most acutely in the euro area and Japan. This is Vanguard's analysis from their own economists, and they said that about oil at $125. At $250, you're not looking at policy complications. You're looking at an economy that enters a spiral it cannot exit without external intervention. The Bank of Japan, already one of the most peculiar central banks in the world, holding interest rates near zero for decades and owning a significant chunk of its own stock market, would face an impossible choice: raise rates to fight imported inflation and crush a debt-laden economy, or hold rates flat and watch the yen collapse as capital floods out. There is no good answer. Japan would be the first major economy to formally enter recession. The oil shock determined the transfer of purchasing power from Japan to oil-producing countries. The $250 version does the same thing, only harder. And here is the detail that makes it even worse for Japan. The 1970s saw the world economy facing stagflation. Japan already has an aging population, stagnant productivity growth, and a government debt to GDP ratio that makes every other country on this list look fiscally responsible. Add an oil shock of this magnitude, and you do not just get recession, you get Japan entering a decade-long restructuring, the kind that reshapes geopolitics. Stay with me, because what I am about to tell you about Europe is even more alarming for a completely different reason. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you why the country you most expect to win in this scenario might actually be the most interesting loser of all. But first, let us talk about the continent that holds the world economy together and what happens to it when the glue dissolves. Europe, 44 countries depending on how you count, a combined economy of roughly $17 trillion, and a relationship with imported energy that you could generously describe as codependent. Imports account for over 2/3 of energy use in countries representing 20% of global GDP, including industrial powerhouses like Germany, Japan, and Italy. Three of the world's 7 largest economies, all of them deeply structurally reliant on energy they do not produce. European Union economies face particularly acute recession risks during oil price spikes due to 87% import dependency. Let me give you the specific number that defines the Europe scenario at $250. Oil at $125 per barrel and natural gas at 150 euros per megawatt hour sustained for the rest of the year could trim a percentage point off Eurozone area real GDP and drag the economy into recession. 1 percentage point off GDP from $125 at $250, you are not looking at a 1-point trim. You are looking at a sustained contraction. The European Central Bank has already postponed planned rate cuts, raised its 2026 inflation forecast, and warned of the risk of stagflation for energy-intensive economies. Germany, the UK, and Italy face the highest recession exposure in Europe. Germany is the one I want to focus on for a moment because Germany is a particularly exquisite case study in economic vulnerability disguised as industrial strength. Germany builds the machines that the world uses to build everything else. Its economy runs on high-precision manufacturing, chemicals, automotive production, and the kind of energy-intensive industrial processes that simply cannot be turned off like a light switch. Germany spent decades building its industrial model around cheap Russian gas and cheap Middle Eastern oil. Then the Ukraine war happened in 2022, and Germany suddenly discovered it had constructed the equivalent of an 11-lane highway with no off-ramp. The costs of higher for longer oil prices would be felt most acutely in the euro area and Japan. At $250 a barrel, German industrial production does not slow, it stops. Chemical plants become unprofitable to run. Automakers face input cost explosions, and the political consequences of a German recession at that severity ripple through the entire European Union because Germany is the fiscal anchor of the whole project. When Germany's economy contracts sharply, the weaker members of the Eurozone, Italy, Spain, Greece, face pressure that their governments may not be able to contain. You do not just get recession, you get political instability. And political instability in Europe historically has a way of metastasizing into something much worse. Both the 1973 and 1979 crises resulted in global stagflation marked by high inflation and economic stagnation, highlighting the vulnerabilities of developed nations dependent on oil. Europe keeps relearning this lesson. It just keeps forgetting it in between the lessons. Now let us pivot to the country whose story at $250 a barrel is simultaneously the most tragic and the most fascinating. I am talking about India. India is the 3rd largest oil importer in the world. India is more than 85% dependent on imports for its needs of crude oil. India imports nearly 5 million barrels of crude oil per day. Let me do the math for you, and please hold on to something because this number is going to unsettle you. At $78 per barrel, India's annual crude oil import bill is roughly $142 billion. At $250 per barrel, that same volume of imports costs $456 billion every year. India's entire GDP is roughly $3 trillion. We're talking about an energy import bill that would approach 15% of the entire economy. From a standing start, a $10 increase in oil prices can raise the country's annual import bill by about $17 to $18 billion, widening the current account deficit by roughly $12 to $15 billion. Scale that up to a $170 increase. The gap between today's price and $250, and you are adding nearly $300 billion to India's annual import bill. The rupee collapses. Higher oil prices increase India's demand for US dollars, putting pressure on the rupee. The Reserve Bank of India faces the same impossible choice Japan faces. The government faces a difficult choice. Pass higher fuel costs to consumers, which increases inflation, or reduce fuel taxes, which lowers government revenue and widens the fiscal deficit. Either path leads to economic pain. The only question is which flavor of pain you choose. Empirical studies suggest that a sustained $10 increase in crude oil prices can reduce India's GDP growth rate by approximately 0.25 to 0.27 percentage points. In this sense, expensive oil acts as an implicit tax on the economy, gradually eroding growth momentum. Extrapolate that across a $170 price increase, India's GDP growth, currently running at 6 to 7% per year, and the envy of the world, drops to something that looks frankly a lot like zero. And here's the thing about India that makes the $250 scenario especially cruel. India has 350 million people who cook food using fuel, not electricity, not gas pipelines, but fuel. Nigeria's government would be awash in crude oil revenues, yet the gulf between what it earns and what its citizens experience is one of the most tragic stories in modern economic history. Oil export revenues have financed almost two-thirds of Nigeria's national budget. At $250 a barrel, the budget swells, but the 40% who are extremely poor do not feel it. That gap between resource wealth at the top and daily misery at the bottom is the defining paradox of the petrostate. Nigeria is its most vivid illustration. Nigeria produces oil, but not as much as it used to. It refines almost none of it. It has both the curse of oil wealth and the curse of oil dependency. At $250, Nigeria's government potentially earns enormous revenues. Whether those revenues reach the Nigerian people is a different story entirely. A story with a very long and very sad history. Now, let's get to the number that changes everything. The real climax of the $250 scenario, a spike in oil prices becomes not just an economic crisis, but a humanitarian one. In lower income countries where populations spend a far greater share of their income on food, rising oil prices could rapidly translate into skyrocketing food prices and lower food supplies. Fertilizer, this is the mechanism that converts an oil price spike into a food crisis. The majority of the world's fertilizer is made from natural gas and oil. When oil hits $250, the cost of producing nitrogen fertilizer rises so sharply that farmers in developing countries can no longer afford to apply it at normal levels. Crop yields fall, food prices rise. And in countries where food already absorbs 60 or 70% of household income, that is not an abstract statistic. It is a famine. Analysis of historical patterns indicates that recession risk accelerates when oil price increases exceed 100% from baseline levels and persist beyond 6-month timeframes. At $250, we are talking about a roughly 215% increase from the current price sustained. That is not a recession risk. That is a near certainty of a global recession so severe that the terminology breaks down. Some regions do not enter recession. They experience something closer to economic collapse. Here is the number I want to leave you with before the final act. Capital Economics recently projected that even in a contained 3-month conflict scenario, Brent could average $150 per barrel over the next 6 months. $150 from a 3-month conflict. To get to $250, you would need something larger, a full closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a simultaneous conflict involving multiple major producers, a permanent disruption to the global oil supply chain that cannot be resolved in months. Roughly 1/5 of global oil consumption flows through the strategically critical Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's oil flowing through a waterway that is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. If that waterway closes, even temporarily, the world runs out of runway very quickly. This is where the subplot resolves. Venezuela, 303 billion barrels. Venezuela went from producing almost 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to only 800,000 barrels per day in December 2025. By the time oil-focused sanctions were imposed in 2019, Venezuela's extraction industry was already in severe structural decline. But here's what changes at $250. That changes nothing else and everything simultaneously. At $250 per barrel, every investor on Earth is looking at Venezuela's 303 billion barrels and doing the math. Even at a fraction of its reserve capacity, even with political risk, Even with infrastructure that has been neglected for 2 decades, the return on capital in Venezuela at $250 oil is so astronomical that rational capital would pour in faster than any sanctions enforcement mechanism could prevent. Pre-sanctions Venezuelan oil revenues typically range between $30 to $50 billion annually. Current sanctions-constrained revenues are estimated at $8 to $15 billion annually. At $250, even at the current constrained production level, Venezuela's theoretical revenues hit something between $120 and $200 billion per year. That is not a failing state. That is a state capable of transformation if the governance, the political will, and the international alignment can be made to work. Venezuela has almost 20% of the world's oil reserves just due to its huge reserves of unconventional ultra-heavy crude oil in the Orinoco Belt, one of the most expensive to extract and process. Normally, that is the reason Venezuela's oil stays in the ground when prices are low. At $250, that constraint evaporates. The heavy oil in the Orinoco Belt, which costs perhaps $60 to $80 per barrel to extract and process, becomes phenomenally profitable at $250. Venezuela becomes overnight the most strategically important energy asset on the planet. And whoever controls that asset, whatever government, whatever international partnership, whatever geopolitical configuration, holds a card that reshapes the entire global energy equation. Empires have risen and fallen on the price of a barrel of crude. That is not hyperbole. It is one of the most well-documented facts in modern history. The 1973 oil shock ended the post-World War II era of global growth and ushered in a decade of stagnation. The discovery of North Sea oil transformed Norway from a modest European economy into one of the wealthiest per capita nations on Earth. The shale revolution transformed the United States from an oil-dependent economy into the world's largest producer and reshuffled the entire geopolitical deck. $250 oil does all of those things at once, faster and with less warning. Throughout modern economic history, major oil price spikes have consistently preceded widespread economic contractions, with sustained crude prices above $120 to $130 per barrel, creating increasing recession probability that approaches virtual certainty. $250 is not $130. $250 is not even in the same neighborhood. The recession at $250 is not a risk, it is the floor. The ceiling is something historians have not had to name yet, and here is the thing that keeps coming back to me every time I work through this scenario. The countries that win are not the ones that earned it, they won the geological lottery. Saudi Arabia did not build anything, it did not innovate, it did not sacrifice. Oil was found under its desert by American engineers decades ago, and the country has been living off that accident of geology ever since. Venezuela sits atop 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia, more than any nation on Earth. At $250 a barrel, those reserves are worth over $75 trillion on paper. That is the entire planet's GDP for a year, sitting underground in a single country. And Venezuela cannot pump any of it. Production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 800,000 barrels per day in 2025. Venezuela has more oil than anyone. Venezuela cannot feed its own people. That contradiction is the key to everything. Every time you hear a country winning from $250 oil, remember, none of them have as much oil as Venezuela. They are rich because of geology. Venezuela is broke because of governance. At $250, the stakes of that distinction become the single most consequential question in global energy geopolitics. Now let's talk about China. China is simultaneously the world's largest oil importer and one of the most insulated from market prices. Russia shipped nearly 2.2 million barrels per day to China in 2024. That makes it the largest single exporter of crude oil to China. Oil hits $250 on the world market. China's competitors, Japan, South Korea, India, Europe, are paying $250. China is buying Russian oil at a discount, say $180, because Western sanctions keep the price of Ural's crude suppressed. China's manufacturing sector suddenly gets a structural energy cost advantage at precisely the moment everyone else is getting crushed. You think China's manufacturing dominance is strong now? At $250 with discounted Russian crude, China does not just compete, it wins by forfeit. Every time oil spikes, the energy arrangement between China and Russia becomes more valuable. At $250, it becomes the most valuable bilateral trade relationship on the planet. China has also been building alternatives: electric vehicles, nuclear power, solar. China's oil use is set to peak by 2025. While the rest of the world was enjoying cheap energy, China was quietly building the infrastructure to run its economy on something other than Saudi crude. At $250 a barrel, that foresight pays off. Now the winners. Saudi Arabia first. 73% of Saudi exports are oil-related. Over the past 3 years, oil revenue accounted for 63% of total government fiscal revenue. Saudi Arabia needs oil prices at almost $100 per barrel to balance its budget. At $250, it does not just balance its budget, it runs a surplus that defies comprehension. The Saudi central bank's net foreign assets stabilized at $415 billion. At $250 oil, Saudi Arabia is printing money faster than it can spend it. Saudi Arabia is spending that money on Vision 2030, the most audacious construction projects in human history. The cruel irony, the project designed to free Saudi Arabia from oil dependence is funded by the very oil revenues it is trying to escape. At $250 a barrel, that funding becomes essentially unlimited. Saudi Arabia would have more money to diversify than any country has ever had for anything. Saudi Arabia keeps oil output at 9 million barrels per day currently. But in a $250 world, the calculus flips entirely. Every extra barrel pumped is $250. Russia is the other winner, but Russia's win is more complicated and more disturbing than Saudi Arabia's. Russia was the world leader in 2024 for oil export surplus. At $250 oil, the financial pressure from Western sanctions effectively disappears. Every dollar that rises above $80 per barrel gives the Russian government a fiscal buffer that sanctions cannot reach. At $250, Russia is not just surviving the sanctions regime, it is thriving under it. Military spending becomes sustainable. Social spending becomes flush. The entire Western strategy of economic attrition gets unwound in months. Years of diplomatic effort, years of market disruption, all undone by a single commodity price. Now, the next section reframes everything. The country I have not mentioned yet is the one most people think they already understand, the United States. The American story at $250 is the most contradictory of all. The US is simultaneously the world's largest oil producer and one of the most oil-sensitive consumer economies. The United States produced an average of 13.4 million barrels per day in August 2024, a new record. It has been the world's top crude oil producer since 2018. At $250, the US produces $3.25 billion per day from domestic oil. That is $1.18 trillion per year flowing into American energy companies and the broader economy. Texas alone, home to the Permian Basin, would experience a fiscal windfall with no modern precedent. Operators in the Permian reported break-even prices of roughly $61 per barrel. At $250, those wells are printing nearly $200 of profit per barrel. At $250, every idle rig comes back online. Every marginal well gets drilled. The shale boom does not just continue, it explodes. The American oil industry at $250 becomes something that makes the original 1980s boom look like a lemonade stand.